Hello everyone. Thank you for coming to our Find Your Ancestors series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Katie Stub. I'm the local history librarian here in Appleton. If you didn't grab a flyer on the way out, we do have one with our January, February, and March talks. We have lots of great speakers coming up, so I'm very excited. We hope you'll join us next month on January 11th, where we're going to have Sue Havel from the Belgian Heritage Center coming to talk about finding your Belgian roots. I also wanted to encourage everyone to take a look at the exhibit that we have on the first floor. It's courtesy of the Max Cade Institute, and it's about the Wisconsin-German experience. It's an awesome exhibit, and there's a short survey that goes along with it that's on this table, so if you didn't have a chance to see the exhibit, please fill out the survey so that we can get some feedback on it. We also have an adult programming survey that's also on that table. We ask you, if you have time to fill it out. It's just a few short questions, and it helps them to know that, hey, you guys want more genealogy programs so that I can keep doing this. I just want to take a quick moment to thank the Friends of the Library. They're really awesome in helping us provide support for these events. So thank you to the Friends. Today's speaker is Deb Anderson. She is the director of the UW Green Bay Archives and Area Research Center, a position she has held for nearly 30 years. Prior to her role there, she served as archivist at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and Deb also regularly serves as a mentor and consultant for local county historical societies and libraries. She's passionate about helping researchers use archival records to find clues for their family history, something she's helped me with a lot, so thank you, Deb. Everybody welcome.
All right, well, I am very happy to be here and excited to have an opportunity to share, hopefully a little bit of knowledge, and we're all about trying to break down barriers and find clues to find our genealogy or our family ancestors. So I hope I can give you some little tidbits. First, a couple of disclaimers, and one is I'm not an expert in every nuance of citizenship. I think that would take like a village kind of to be able to do that, because there's so many variations depending in part on your ethnicity, depending on when you arrived, where you arrived, your circumstances on arrival, and so on. So I think too that there's always exceptions and new finds. So we all are aware that in today's world, next week there's going to be something new available via Ancestry, on the web, Cities List, whatever it might be. So new things are cropping up all of the time. And I have to also tell you, as I speak today, I have to tell you one of my biases. And one of my biases is that when I do genealogy, and I help people do genealogy, I think that our goal is more than just names and dates. So you're going to hear me talk about things that are more than names and dates. So I believe that whether it's finding your immigrant ancestor or finding another branch on your family tree, that the goal really is to bring that person back to life and tell their story. So I'm going to be talking about some records that may not just get exactly like, I just want to know the name of the ship. I'm going to give you some things that might bring that immigrant ancestor back to life. And the other disclaimer is that, shockingly, not everything can be found by clicking. You might think that we can in today's world, but not quite everything still is available by a click. So let me see if I can give you some information here. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background. This is a lot of legalese, but I think it's important to understand kind of the history of the immigrant process here in America, and to understand why things were happening, because that will inform as you try to go on that journey of finding records then. So the process or the role or the task of becoming a citizen started shortly after the United States was established, and actually the first citizenship laws passed already in 1790, which is pretty quick. And that first act said, quote, that any free white person who's over the age of 21 and had lived in the United States for at least 2 years could become a citizen of any port in the state or territory. But they had to have lived in that state for 1 year before they became a citizen. So you also had to prove that you were a good moral character. Now I did a lot of research on that, like how are you going to prove that you're a good moral character? I don't know what that was. Lie detector tests weren't invented yet in 1790. So there's no information that tells us what was a good moral character. So you just had to prove that you were. And then you had to take an oath that you would subscribe to the United States and its principles. So interestingly, we think that's a pretty good law right now, maybe. That was viewed as too liberal for the time period. They said, no, that's not exactly what we want to do. So the law is quickly repealed and more restrictive laws come into place. And the biggest one was in 1795, and they passed 4 parts to that. So the first part was that free white aliens had to declare their intention to become a citizen. And they had to give up their allegiance to a foreign prince, a potentate, state, sovereignty, etc. They changed their residence requirements, and you now had to live at least 5 years in the United States. So they've lengthened it, right? So they're making it more conservative. And you had to be, again, 1 year in the state or territory that you applied to. And I found this little extra part here. Aliens who had been born or inherited a title or were noblemen or noblewomen, they had to give that up if they wanted to be part of the United States. That law also is the one that changes it from a one-step process, which is what first happened, to now what we have, which is a 2-step process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those steps later in my talk. So this law in 1795 gave citizenship to wives and children if the male became a citizen. So that's how the women and minors were citizens. In 1798, so just like 3 short years later, there's a new law that's passed. It's called the Alien Act, and it comes into being because the government wants to start regulating immigration. So some of these things, as I was putting these talks and my notes together for this, there's an echo of today's circumstances, right? So no commentary, but there is very much an echo no matter what side you're on. So this Alien Act is the first beginning of that. And what it basically did is it lengthened the time period that you had to wait to become a citizen. So you had to wait 14 years living in the United States before you could even say, hey, I want to be a citizen and join you. And then you had to live 5 years in that state or territory. So that law is in place only a few short years again, and a new law comes in, 1802, and that's kind of the law that stays in place for many of the ancestors that you might be trying to find. The 1802 law stipulates that you have to appear before a court and say that you want to be a citizen. You have to give up your oath of allegiance to the United States again. You have to still live 5 years in the United States, so that shrunk from 14 years to 5. And then 1 year in the state that you're filling out your paperwork. And again, it goes back to saying that you have to demonstrate good moral character, no definition again, or no way that, we don't know how they were assessing that. And I found this was interesting. In 1802, they added a new part to the law, which says you must subscribe to all the principles of the Constitution. So that comes in 1802. And the children of naturalized citizens became citizens that way as well. So there's a few changes between 1802 and 1906, but then there's a big change in 1906, which impacts many people who are trying to find their ancestors. Those changes were that it created for the first time the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization, and that oversaw the process. Up until that point, it was more the individual courts overseeing the process. So while there's federal laws, everything's being decided at a local court. So that changes in 1906. And in 1906, they said, no, we want to not have all these individual things happening. We want naturalization process or citizenship process to be uniform. And what that meant is specific forms were identified that they would be using, specific questions were outlined that would be asked. So up until this point, it was sort of happenstance, and we did some research and came across some newspaper articles that literally the questions that might be on some forms were determined by the local stationery store. So you would go to the local stationery store or the printer store if you're the court and get your forms, right? And that particular court thought, well, we should ask these questions, or that stationery store. And down the road or next state over, they thought these questions should be asked. So until 1906, you see a lot of unevenness between county to county, year to year. And that law in 1906 also said that The records that you file at the county or the local level now must have a copy of them sent to the immigration or the Bureau of Immigration in Washington, D.C. So those of you who are on Ancestry and you see little 3x5 cards maybe that come, or if you're looking in National Archives, you'll see these 3x5 cards, and those are coming from the copies that were filed then, the duplicate copies filed up in the Washington, D.C. office. Major law change in 1906 then. For my staff, what that means is the volumes that we have to get out for you got bigger in 1906. It used to be little things that we could carry, so we get our muscles going then. In Wisconsin, they tinker a little bit in 1908, and what happens there, again, changing things pretty significantly, is that the Wisconsin Constitution says for the first time, you must be a full citizen to vote. So that's 1908. We're 10 years out from World War I, roughly. But what that means is, until 1908, you could just do the first step, and you could vote in Wisconsin. So as you process that and think about that, there's implications for what it means with your digging for your ancestors or your immigrants. Because if I'm the German farmer and I came here and I'm not very adept at the English language, and I think well, I can vote, they told me I can vote, and I just did my first papers, I have no reason to think that I need to do those second papers then. So that becomes key, that law. And then on the federal level, and then implicating for all of us, it's not until 1922 that women can become a citizen separately. So up until that point, they became a citizen only if they were married to somebody who would become a citizen. And there's some evidence and suggestions and instances where if you were born in the United States and you married an alien, you lost your citizenship status if that person did not become a citizen. So I don't know about the rest of the women in the room, but if that law had come into being right now, I know that I probably would have camped out at the courthouse, but I would have been there within a few days, right, of that law being passed. And so you would expect that we would be able to open up the citizenship books and turn to them. And in 1922, we just see this flood of women. That doesn't happen. So it's silent. It doesn't take place that way at all. There's a few here and there, but not very many. So in addition to women, I wanted to talk just a couple special notes law-wise about minors, military service, African Americans, and Native Americans. So how does that play out in terms of citizenship record? So a minor, similar to a woman, becomes a citizen if their father became a citizen. You have to remember, and this stumps a lot of people, a minor during the bulk of the time period that we're talking about is somebody under 21. So today we don't define a minor like that. So you'll see, and in some instances they even call the 21-year-old an infant. So to say, this person, an infant, decided to become a citizen kind of thing. And you're like, an infant, what? They're 20, 21. So it's that time period, that definition. So there's a lot of people who came here as minors, right? You're an immigrant, come from an immigrant family, your mom and dad come here, your father is here, you've always been, and you come as a 5-year-old or a 3-year-old, a 9-year-old, whatever it is. You've always been told throughout your life that your father became a citizen, so you think you're good to go. And again, this will only apply to the sons, the boys. So you think, I'm a citizen, Dad did this paperwork. Well, what's happening though is Dad did the first paperwork, the first papers, because Dad thought that's what made him a citizen. So between World War I and World War II especially, and in that World War II range, you see a pretty good flood of people, a significant number, where the minor child, or the person who came as a minor, all of a sudden now is a 30-year-old male, and he's back in court having to get his final papers. And he'll testify and say, well, I voted in elections for the last 20 years. I'm the president of the school board, and I served as the town treasurer. And so please let me be a citizen. And that's happening for a lot of different reasons. My own interpretation of it is that the courts were realizing, like, wait, are all the I's dotted and the T's crossed here? And especially think of the time period. So if I've got my good German Kramer name, and they're starting to check, and I only did the first papers, or my dad did, then I'm not truly a citizen. I owned land and I voted in Wisconsin for 30 years, held office, but I'm not really a citizen. So you see a lot of people who are doing that as a second, decades and decades after they came here. And that might be one, it'll be a tip I give you later, but also here, that a lot of people put their blinders on and only think, well, I'm looking for my immigrant and I know that they came in 1859 or whatever it is. So here's a name that's the same, but that's 1913, that can't be him, or 1922, that can't be him. But this is that very example. If that minor has to wait or does wait, then you have to think beyond that box. So in terms of military service, in 1862, 1 year after the Civil War starts, a law was passed that allowed individuals who would serve in the U.S. armies or any military branch to become citizens by waiving the first papers, so they skipped that step of the process, and their time period that they had to live was reduced to, or live in the state was reduced to only 1 year. So basically you're exempted out. That law stays on the books and then is added to in 1918, in which many aliens were serving in World War II, and there is no first papers, and you don't have to be a resident of any length of time. So literally, you can get off the boat, and we can make you a citizen if you're agreeing to serve in our army then. So sometimes this would be another example of where you need to broaden your thoughts about where you might find records. They made you a citizen right on the military post in World War I, or in whatever courthouse would be near wherever you're stationed. So it wouldn't be back at home, so to speak. African Americans become citizens by law, or a law allowing them to become citizens is in 1870. This Native American part was kind of, it's tough to word, right? So Native Americans could become, quote, citizens through treaties and special statutes. And the first one is in 1887, or a formal law. Everybody who was receiving federal payments could then automatically be grandfathered in and become a citizen, as long as they had, quote, adopted the habits of civilized life. 1924 law allows all Native Americans to become U.S. citizens. So it should be noted that when we talk about citizenship laws and status, it really does become a tool of political and military maneuvering in some instances. There's one story in a newspaper that we found, though it's not all politics. We found a newspaper article that talked about wild wolf bounty claims. So wild wolf bounty claim is what it sounds: go to the woods, bring in a wolf, gets money. So one of the Marinette newspaper, I think it was, suggested that if you were a citizen and had taken out your citizenship paperwork, you'd get better money for your wolf than the alien who had not taken out that. So I don't know, fun stuff going on. So questions on that law part? Yes?
I just want to thank you for answering the question from my grandmother came over from Wales in 1903 or 8 or something like that, and I was going through all those stuff and I saw U.S. citizenship. I said, what? This is like in the early 1960s. I said, what in the world is she?
Yep.
So I assume she
Same
was
exact kind of thing.
Thank you.
Question?
So the people who were here in those early years, say the 1700s, did they, even though they were born here, say, did they still have to apply?
No, it would just be new people coming over.
The new,
Right.
even though they were new, before it was a country, say.
So if it's before it's a country, then if you're born here, like, are you thinking 1680s pilgrims born here that way, or?
Right.
So I'm not as sure on that part. I assume that you're grandfathered, grandmothered in, or that it doesn't apply. I didn't check on that part, because the first formal law isn't until that 1791. So that's roughly less than 20 years after the Declaration of Independence. So it's a good question, though. Yes?
I was understanding that people that came from Europe because of lack of land, the first thing they wanted to do was buy land, or from wherever, land companies or homestead or whatever, but that you couldn't buy land unless you had applied for citizenship.
That's true, and I'll come to that in a little bit later. Yeah, exactly right.
And, well, my other part of it when did they pass the law about did not have any communicable diseases like tuberculosis?
So that would be on entry coming in. So that, what you're talking about is, what are you bringing with you when you come to America? So if we think about movies or books that we've read and we see scenes, or if you've been to Ellis Island and the museum there, you see all these scenes. Is that what you're talking about, where they're checking, are you insane? Do you have this kind of eye disease or whatever? Those laws are, I think my impression is that they're more like in the 1880s. We start seeing that when you see massive influxes of individuals coming.
I have a friend that's a Stockbridge, India. So his grandparents didn't become U.S. citizens until 1920.
So they become citizens as the treaties are passed, and so that's always a part of a treaty. And then there's a major law that's passed for Native Americans in 1887 that expands that boundary and expands those definitions. So even treaties happening before 1887, you become a citizen if you're a Native American per the points in the treaty. Yeah.
So from a U.S. citizen standpoint, I had a great-great-grandfather come over from Brandenburg, Germany, and they went directly to Horicon, Wisconsin. And then he was in the Civil War. So was he a U.S. citizen?
So what the Civil War law does is it allows you to skip the first step. So it says you don't have to fill out and say you intend to become a citizen. You can just jump to the final step, making you a citizen. You still have to do the paperwork. So if you don't do any paperwork, then you're just still a German immigrant.
According to the information I had, he was drafted. I didn't know they would have that draft.
They did.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to jump to the next aspect here, which is, okay, so now we understand a little bit about the law. How do we find these elusive people and information about them, or they might seem elusive? So to me, the first place you want to start is sources that you would have at home. So we kind of have some things representative up here in the pictures. On the bottom here, you see this idea of a frame certificate. The citizenship process at certain points in time, you would come and you would say, I want to become a citizen, or I am going to do, and you finish all the paperwork. They would literally tear out the certificate from a book, and you would have it almost like a frameable item that would go home with you. So we have people who come in, researchers, and they say, oh, I've got this. If we could read this document, you'll see it doesn't give lots of information, because mostly what it's doing is it's proof of your citizenship. So it does little except tell you, you got this citizenship thing in this particular court or this particular location. So a frame certificate might be in your family trunk. The thing that I like is family traditions. So to think about that, and this is presuming that you're starting from almost like nowhere, right? Like I don't have any clue at all where I should be looking. So it could be something as little as everybody in our family has red hair. Oh yeah, that's because great-grandma was born in Ireland. So, you know, a stereotype kind of thing. Or in my case, it would be, why are we having this lutefisk again on Christmas Eve? And, okay, well, Norwegian roots or heritage there might give you that clue and start you looking. Family Bibles up in the top there. Many of us are familiar with the idea that center part where it opens up and there are names and dates of individuals that somebody had recorded, but sometimes they will also record where that person was born, so you want to look for clues like that. Long lost relatives, those family reunions do really matter, so you want to make yourself go to some of them if you know, they won't be really as boring as you think. And it's the idea that your branch of the family might not have had information come down the line or in the oral stories, but maybe a cousin or a third generation has something that you don't know about, that clue that you're looking for. And then lastly, I have scrapbooks and photo albums. To think about that clothing conveys a certain type of country. So for example, there's a certain area in Belgium that makes a certain kind of lace. So if you see that lace collar, a lace cuff on a dress, a lace hat, you might have a clue about what part of Belgium you might be looking at. Or the clothes and the scrapbooks will give you a sense of a time period too, that to understand like, oh, this is where I need to start digging. So home sources are a really excellent place to begin. But for most of us, the best place to start your research after the home is to dig around in census records. That is the important tool that will help you find your immigrant ancestor. When researchers come to our archives, it's almost the first question we ask them. Have you done any work in the census yet? And how can we help you do that so you can get a sense of your family? So why do I say ancestor or census? It allows you to narrow down the arrival times of when an individual might have come, ages, of who might have been born here first in their family, etc. So if you haven't used a census, it is every 10 years that the federal government counted all of us. So does anybody know what exciting thing is happening in 2022 in the genealogy world? Let's see if I did my math right. 1950 census is coming out. So the census is restricted for 72 years. So the 1951 will be coming out in 2022. The census exists from 1790 then until 1940 is what we have right now. The amount of questions asked on the census increases as you go through time and is very brief in the very beginning. So as we go through time, and if we look or think back to the laws that I was talking about, as the government, for political reasons, land reasons, whatever it might be, needed to track us better, they asked more questions in that census. So that's great, the government's using it for tracking, but we get to use it to find our ancestor. Question?
What's the reason they keep it
confidential?
Yeah.
So the law was set up long ago, and it's an average lifespan. I always joke and say that A, we'll either be dead, or we won't really care if anybody knows that we had a radio or didn't have a radio, because that's one of the questions that they ask eventually. So that's what they picked, is 72 used to be more like an average lifespan. So somebody who's in that census as a 50-year-old, they're now, whatever, 100 and some years old, so odds are that they won't care what you're reading about them in the census. So that's kind of a short answer to that. But it's established by law, and it's always going to be in place unless that law were to be rescinded. It'll be interesting, as you all should have probably done the 2010 census yourself, and it will be interesting as we have short forms and different kinds of questions are being tossed around, what we want to be asking in the 2020 census as well. So genealogy in the future is going to be vastly different, I think. Does that answer your question?
I just was wondering the reasoning for keeping it. I mean, you told me the reason for the time frame, but what's the reason for doing it at all and keeping it confidential?
It's because the questions that they were asking were viewed as not ones that you would make immediately available for a variety of reasons, is the way I understand it. So that's why I joked, like, you're in 1930, 1940, you're asked a question if you have a radio. I would expect in the 1950, 1960, you're asked if you have a television set. So I was kind of joking that, we don't care about that kind of information, but there were pieces of it, like if I could, they ask you your household wealth in one of the censuses, they ask if you can read or write, speak English, go to school, etc. So there are some of those things that were viewed as sensitive that we wouldn't just put them out there in 1921, right after the census was taken.
So you said the first census was
1790. So for us in Wisconsin, the first one that we would show up in will be like the territory of Michigan, and it would be around 1820 or so. So the census, similar to naturalization laws, they're going to change and add information to them, like I was mentioning. So the first time you know a country of origin where they ask that question is the 1850 census. So any census prior to 1850, they don't ask where you're from. So that when, 1850 on starts helping you a little bit more with finding your immigrant ancestor. The 1880 census is the first one that asks the birthplace of your parents. So they'll ask your birthplace, and then they'll say, where was your father born? Where was your mother born? That doesn't happen until 1880. So even if I'm born in, whatever, Topeka, and they ask about my parents who were born in Russia, I now have a clue then about my ancestor. So I'll answer I'm born in Kansas. Now I'll answer that my father's born in Russia and my mother's born in Britain or whatever. So that happens in 1880, but interestingly, they don't ask that question in the 1940 census. Beginning in 1900, they asked the question, how long have you been in America? Now, we've had some researchers that we've helped with that, and sometimes genealogists can be stubborn. Have you ever encountered that at all? Like, a little bit set in their path that they're going on? So sometimes it will be like the researcher will say, well, that's not my right person because I know they came to America here, and that says that they were here 5 years before, 5 years after. Think about the census and how it's taken and how those questions are asked and answered. The census was literally the census taker going down the door, going down the road, knocking on the door and asking questions. If you were out in the field and your 12-year-old child was home, census taker will ask your 12-year-old child the answers to those questions. If you're not home at all because you've gone to town, they'll ask your neighbor those questions about you. So the census the information in there is only as good as the person who's reporting it. Sometimes our ancestors may or may not have shaved the truth a little bit for a variety of reasons. Meaning, for example, a lot of them left Europe to avoid serving in the military. So if I'm thinking that, well, if I answer this question this way, does that mean I'm going to have to serve in the American military? So I might shave a couple years off, add a couple years on, round things up, whatever it might be. Memories fail as you go through the census process. People answer differently. The year of immigration and language that the person spoke was first added as a 1910 census question. So then that allows you to see a little bit more clearly, again, that kind of information. And then the big one is whether they had naturalized. And that question comes in for the first time in 1900. And we help a lot of people here, let's see if I can get this to work. A lot of people have a misconception on the census where we have these columns here, and this is the column where it's asking that question. Are you a citizenship? Where are you a citizen? Where are you at in the citizenship process? So a lot of people think that this thing up here, depending on the messy census taker's handwriting, says no. It doesn't. It says NA, which means naturalized, which means they did the whole process in theory. This one down at the bottom here, PA, doesn't mean PA, but it means petition applied for. They did the first step, or declaration of intention, we actually call it. And then this one right here, AL, is, does anybody know? Alien. So that means they've done nothing to that point. When I help people do research, the NA and the PA, I don't get too hung up on that because, again, I might not understand your question because I might think those first papers made me a citizen. You ask me, I'm going to say NA, I'm a citizen, if I don't understand. Or I might have other reasons for saying, yep, I'm a citizen. So be aware of that. That's always the clue, and when we're starting to help people do their research, that's why we hone in on that 1900 census where they first ask it and start getting our clues that we need. 1920 census adds a question as well, and that one is, what is the mother tongue of your parents? So again, we're getting at that information of the generation before the person who's taking the census. 1920 census adds the question, when did you become a citizen? So that narrows things down as well. There were changes in the instructions given to census takers, and that's like a whole different talk, census records. But the instructions that were given to the census takers are fascinating to look at. And there's a change in there that happens around World War I-ish, and that is that census takers were told you have to be specific when you ask the question of their country of origin. So up until around this change, you could just answer Germany, and that was good enough. You could say Austria, good enough. But now, as we're moving into World War I, there's international conflict. They needed to record Baden, or they needed to record Württemberg, or Bavaria, or Brabant, or specific regions of countries. So that's why you're going to see things change around, and you get like Austro-Czech, or you get some differences like that, Bohemia Czech, and before you would not have had that. The law makes things different. I'm sure that most of us have played around a little bit on Ancestry or some kind of online tool trying to find our immigrant ancestors. I would suggest with the census, if you really can't find anybody through the tools that keep popping up for you to try, I recommend checking the census records and browsing them the painful old-fashioned way. You don't have to quite go to microfilm. There's ways that within Ancestry or whatever that you can bypass a name search and then look at the idea as, well, I know that they were in Seymour, so I'm going to start going through the Seymour records. And you just do that by a separate kind of census search within Ancestry, for example, the same for family search, where you're going to hone in geographically and ignore the names then and do it that way. And then you might not find your exact ancestor because maybe they came between census years, but you'll see neighbors and neighborhoods, and then you'll get more specific information. All right, moving ahead. So census records is the best one by far to look at citizenship records, but there are some other ones that either start out in a courthouse or in a library or have found their way into an archives or a library. So I just made a list up here for us, and I'll just talk about them very briefly. Vital records, so birth, death, and marriage records, in and of themselves might not be very helpful. So I would always start with the death record, because the death record is going to give you the name of the person who died and hopefully where they came from. Again, remember though, the death record is only as good as the person filling out the information. So if dad dies and he only told his kids we're from the forests of Bavaria or whatever, that's all you're going to get from the kid who's filling out the death certificate. But if dad was very proud and knew we're from this exact city in Norway, then you might have a little bit more information. Marriage records would be the next one where they're going to ask that question where you might have hope of finding some specific cities or specific locations. And I was reading about researchers who, and have experienced it myself, where oftentimes we just really hone in on the direct ancestor. And here's where an example, if you get stuck and you can't find anything through the direct ancestor, broaden your search and go to what they call collateral lines. Go look for a cousin, go look for an aunt, go look for an uncle. Because maybe whoever filled out their death certificate knew that exact town. And so you want to try to be broad that way. Cemetery records, I think the most helpful thing on a cemetery record is if there is a specific area in a cemetery that's known as, yep, that's the Irish people are buried over there, or it's always been that way, or sometimes you might have foreign words that show up on the tombstone, and those will give you clues of where somebody might have been buried. Sometimes occupations show up in the cemetery or tombstone art. That might give a little bit of a feeling as well. Church records would be similar to vital records, but be on the lookout for churches that have ethnic identities. So in Green Bay, for example, there are multiple Catholic churches during the waves of immigration, during the Heights, and this one over here is Belgian, and this one over here is French, and this one over here is Polish. So if you kind of can start to look at churches in that way, in an ethnic identity type of way, you can find clues for yourself as well. I would encourage you, though, to be careful about that. From my own story here, my dad's family came from Sweden, and they were Lutherans, and they went to this town in Iowa, and my great-grandpa looked around, and he said, we're in America now. We are going to do American things, and that includes where we go to church, because the Lutheran church had services in Sweden, in Swedish. And he said, nope, we're in America now. So just like that, but they became Baptist, because that was the only church that was in English. So it's very fascinating. So I have to look in Swedish Baptist records. So try different things. So look at the records, and let's say you're looking in church records, or you're trying to find your specific person, and you're like, I can't find him, I can't find him. Think about everybody else who's attending that church. Look at witnesses, look at names of sponsors and so on, and find those records within that church that start to specify a country in Europe or wherever it might be. Sometimes published records, local history books, will give you information as well. Word of caution though, so if you do history of Outagamie County, those kinds of histories published in the 1880s, 1800s were subscription histories, so to be in them I paid. So if I'm an Irish immigrant working on the railroad, I'm probably not paying to be in that book. So, but every once in a while, there's little gems that will show up in there, and they might be talking about, again, that idea of a certain church connected to a ethnic group and so on. So think about local histories. The ones that I find that are often better are those that are published either in 1976 or are around in there when the United States is celebrating the bicentennial of its founding. Lots of times, communities in Wisconsin in particular are starting to hit that 100-year mark. Those will be broader in their content. They're not subscription histories, and so everybody gets represented in there. And so those will have good historical sketches of certain immigrant groups. Also look for histories that are published on certain ethnic groups for your geographic area. There's a great series published by the state of Wisconsin, if you haven't seen it. It's like Finns in Wisconsin, Germans in Wisconsin, just little books. And they give you a really good sense of your immigrant group and its experience in Wisconsin. One of my favorite things that I would look for if I was digging around for published sources is something called an Immigrant guide. So most of the time I've been talking about immigrants, coming. So this is Immigrant, leaving. And there's a great immigrant guide that was published by a man named Samuel Freeman in 1853 in Wisconsin. And it's digitized and out there on the State Historical Society website. So the Immigrant guide is written to try to entice you to come to Wisconsin. So you are the farmer in Poland, you are the farmer in Belgium, whatever, and you get your hands on this immigrant guide. This is what might spark you and make you decide, yes, I do want to go there. You know, we're talking about the clean, brisk air, so Wisconsin seems like the place for me. So look for those. And then probably a secret in published sources that a lot of people don't know about is something called state and local laws. They most often turn up in a book format, and I haven't seen them digitized yet. So state and local laws are sort of like the name implies, that it's laws that are being passed within the state or in a local area, and they can be about so-and-so Martin Smith is going to get a ferry license to operate a ferry across the Fox River. So, okay, that doesn't necessarily pertain to what we're talking about, but it also includes so-and-so now wants to change their name and be called this. And usually that's an Americanization process of names. So state and local laws is a good place to check as well. Those are probably going to be, for the most part, in university libraries, I would think, and the Wisconsin Historical Society would have them as well. So we've got newspapers up here, so obituaries often would be a gold mine. A good obituary will at least get you a province, if not a specific town. There are certain time periods the newspapers are very chatty, so they will publish lists of people who are arriving or coming or new to our town or whatever it might be. There will be references to mail order brides. Many of you might have that story in your family tree that his first wife died and he sent for a new one from the old country. And so sometimes those kinds of things will be showing up in the newspapers as well. Military records, we started to talk about that a little bit with the Civil War. So many new immigrants came and literally signed up the next year or right away. They were glad to serve their new country. They felt it was a way that they could give to the new country. So enlistment records and pension records do show the place of birth for those individuals. And then if you've seen on Ancestry, World War I and World War II draft cards are now available, and they also will list the place. Some of the military records will talk about returning to a home country, so you might be looking for that. Usually that would be in a pension file as well. Social Security records come into existence in the 1940s, and interestingly, by 1940, the majority of the immigrants in the last third century, so that last wave, would have filled out Social Security cards. They asked that question, where were you born? And we had talked about the idea of Homestead Act. So these are federal land grants to own land, get it from the federal government. And you were required to have finished the first papers, not the second necessarily, but it did ask for specific birth information. So before you can get your homestead, you have to give us that birth information. I would also add court records, and I thought about not putting it on there because it's going to be sort of a needle in a haystack. And what you might encounter in a court record for your ancestor in terms of this immigrant quest won't be complimentary. So, and that doesn't mean that they committed a crime. It could be arguing over a fence line, and it will say what we would now consider derogatory terms. So, halak, all those kinds of things will be in there. And so that gives you maybe another little bit of a clue. So, archival collections. And this is what I do every day of my life, work with the archival collections. So a lot of people shy away from them. They're like, just get me to the citizenship papers. Why would I want to muck around in these kinds of things? And if I was talking to a little bit younger audience, they would go like, what? What's that foreign language up there? I can't read that writing. You want me to look at it? So don't be afraid by the archival collections. And I gave some examples up here that to consider what we call manuscript collections, and that's defined as papers of individuals, private organizations, and businesses. So you're like, well, unless you have the papers of my ancestor, why would I want to look at somebody else's papers? How's that going to help me? And those who know me say, oh, she was just challenged if I say that's not going to help her. So I always like to do that. So the typed thing up here is an example of a man who sat down and he wanted to tell the story of checks in Manitowoc and Peabody County. So this is a man named Frank Benz, and he, in telling the story of checks and in Manitowoc and Peabody County, he lists name after name after name, as well as traditions and stores and ownership and so on. The handwritten one on this other side is another individual, a guy named Harry White, and it's one of the few sources we have that document this ethnic group. He sat down in Door County and wrote the story of Icelandic settlers in Door County. So it's just a few pages in his handwriting, but he talks about those settlements. So to look for the idea of maybe memoirs, diaries of individuals who might have lived in that same area as yours. And there's a couple samples up here, the Wisconsin check, and then this lovely gentleman in his photograph here. You can look for records of ethnic organizations. So the guy with his photograph, he's from Marinette, and the ethnic organization is called Sons of Sweden. So it's like a fraternal lodge. So you had to be Swedish to belong to this club, exclusive club, and they took a photograph of all of them, formal portraits, and they wrote a Swedish biography of him. And then we have volunteers prior to my time of coming who nicely translated all that for us, so we don't have to read Swedish. So that's an example of where you want to look for that ethnic set of records or ethnic organizations. And Wisconsin Checks is another one. They're an organization in the Valley area, but we hold their records as well. So if you have check things, that might be something to be looking at. Sometimes you should be looking at records of businesses that an archives might have, and you're going, well, again, if it's not my ancestor's business, why would I look at that? The long skinny list in the middle there is from a newspaper called Der Landsmann, which is a German published newspaper in Green Bay. That's a list of the people who got the newspaper. German after German after German name. So that would be an example. In Brown County, Pulaski, as some of you might know, is very Polish ethnic based, and that community in that region was settled by a guy who owned a land company, but he was in Milwaukee. So we've used the J.J. Hoff Land Company records, and it reads like a who's who of the first Pulaski settlers then, or all the people in that area, because J.J. Hoff was selling land from Milwaukee in the Great North Woods, right? You might also think about archival collections that are gathered around an ethnic theme. So for example, we house and created something that's called the Belgian American Research Collection, and it dates back to 1976, and it has oral history interviews, photographs, etc. A spin-off of that, and this would be another example of go look for things that are your right ethnic group, is a man who was really interested in Civil War research, but also was descended from Belgian Americans himself. So he took it upon himself to write a book about Belgian Americans who served in the Civil War. So, and in doing that, he gave us, we have the published book, but he also gave us all his research files. So that's a wealth of information as well. There's a great collection at the Wisconsin Historical Society called Germans in Wisconsin. Not all in German. There's a good enough amount that's English. This goes back to my point at the beginning in my disclaimer, where I said that I believe you need to put the life back into that person. So Germans in Wisconsin, we may or may not hit your ancestor, but you definitely will know what it's like to be a German immigrant in Wisconsin during certain time periods. Similar, there's a huge collection at UW Milwaukee of a Polish photographer. His name is Roman Kwasniewski, And it's an amazing, beautiful collection that gets national attention. Again, if you want to know what it was like to be Polish in an urban setting in the 1900s, this collection will do that for you. In the 1950s, the Wisconsin Historical Society did a really big project, and it was called Ethnic Oral History Recordings, I think. So they literally set out to try to record and capture the story of individuals who were of different ethnic groups. And here they were pretty broad, so they didn't just stick to the Germanic, Nordic, the traditional kinds of immigrants. They were looking at Syrian, they were looking at Italian, and so on. So trying to capture those stories. And then the Wisconsin Historical Society has also digitized a series of interviews that they did in the 70s of survivors of the Holocaust who ended up settling in Wisconsin. So that's another amazing collection. I would encourage you, though, to think about outside the box. Like, one of my favorite immigrant collections wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with my family, but I think they could paint that picture in a better way than anything I've ever seen about what that experience was like coming here. So there's a guy named Matthew Willis, and another guy named Frederick Tillman, and they write extensive correspondence back home, telling about what's happening when they get here. So Frederick Tillman is a guy who settles in La Crosse, and you're like, well, I don't have anybody in La Crosse, that's not going to pertain to me. But he was a German and a doctor, so he's pretty literate, so he can read and write pretty well. So he talks about what that experience was on the boat and on the ship. And so that's that idea of bringing that person back to life. It was an eye-opener to me, maybe I'm just naive, because, or maybe I watched too many movies. My perception is like, oh, it was horrible on the boat, and they all were in this together, and they all were experiencing this horrible thing. I mean, I knew there was steerage and so on. But Dr. Tillman talks about being woke up one night in his diary. I was woke up in the wee hours of the morning by music coming aboard from above deck, and I went to see, and the Irish filth had gotten up a jig. So he talks about what his feelings are. So it was like, oh, not everybody was happy there. If you have what I would call more recent immigrants, meaning World War II and forward, there are a lot of set of records that deal with helping them resettle, so to speak. Not necessarily like, okay, we're going to make you American now, but the idea of a displaced person and refugees resettling. And there's some great collections at the state and at UW Milwaukee that help you with that. We just work with an individual who's trying to find her Latvian grandmother. She's a second generation, a 30-year-old. And so we were able to look at these displaced persons records, and we did find her grandmother happened to be mentioned in it, because you had to have a sponsor when you came after World War II. So we found the records with the sponsor, we've got those information. So, on to the actual idea of what is in a citizenship process and what kinds of records are you going to be looking at and what do all these words mean. So when you're going to become a citizen, there's a boatload of paperwork that gets finished and lots of different kinds of documents. And I should add a disclaimer here that not all counties are created equal. So remember I said that, the stationery store says, let's ask this on our form. They might have different requirements, et cetera. If you're doing things outside of Wisconsin, certainly across states, things are not the same. So you have to have a little bit of leeway there. So the first set of papers is called Declarations of Intention, saying I declare that I am intending to become a citizen is basically what it amounts to. Lots of people call these first papers, in a census, they're called PA. They typically are filed within a few months or years of arrival. Now, a lot of people have the misconception that, like, I know they came through New York, and it took them a while to get here, so they must have done their declaration of intention somewhere else. Probably not, because getting here was their destination. So if they would have stayed in New York to try to earn more money or get their feet underneath of them, and they stayed there a good number of months or years, then maybe you're going to stay in New York. But if it was just that journey to get from point A to point B, the papers probably are not filed along the way. Because remember, the law says you have to live in that place 1 year before you can become a citizen or file. So, like the census, the early records provide almost no information at all. The little one over here is a pretty typical of an early census or early declaration of intention. You have the individual's name here, and I can tell from looking at this and looking at the signature, this part up here is most often written by the clerk. So if this is me doing this research, I will take that spelling second over trying to figure out what that spelling is when I'm doing it. This is somebody who hears my name with my accent and writes down what they think I say, right? It asks, in this one, the way it's organized is that he's going to give up his allegiance here is to one of the, sorry, where he's born. So we get a little bit of detail. He's born in one of the duchies then. And we have his birth, usually only a year on these kind of forms. He came into the port of New York, and you have June and a certain year. He's going to give up his allegiance to the Grand Duke. And then you have the date that he actually does this paperwork down here. So those are the parts of the Declaration of Intention. You see on this one that there's almost minimal detail, but enough detail that you wouldn't burn your eyeballs out looking for hours and hours on a ship's passenger list trying to find something. Because I can at least get a port of arrival, and I can get a month and a year. Pretty good, maybe giving me some clues of where I need to go to. As wars go on, as military needs, as political needs come into place, laws change, they ask more and more questions. So this one in the center is from the 1920s. So World War I is over. We're starting to become worried about communists and Eastern European immigrants coming in. So the federal government decides, let's ask more questions then to, quote, protect ourselves, right? So in here you'll see that they ask for a physical description, that this person has a dark complexion, 5'6", 48 pounds, black eyes, brown, or black hair, brown eyes, etc. No distinctive marks. A distinctive mark can be as much as a scar on your little finger, might be recorded on there. This one, so they ask the question, where was I born? So Posen, Germany, Poland. Now you might be scratching your head and going like, wait, Germany and Poland, those are two separate things. But you have to again figure out the time period that you're talking about. He does give an exact birth date, and he tells us where he's living right now. Here though, he can't remember the name of the ship that he came on. And I would guess probably that's because this form was filled out much later from when he first came. So again, because it's 1920 and between wars, and so he's probably doing his paperwork to protect himself somewhat. And so, yeah, that's exactly what's going on here. Because look, he says he came in 1869, and he's filling this out in 1920. So I always wonder, what's the story that makes you go to the courthouse in 1920? I really would like to know that part all the time. What's the story there? And then if you notice, way down here, he can't write. So we've got an X, and it's his mark. So then you consider like, okay, this spelling here and this spelling here was written by the same person, that clerk, who may or may not speak Polish, right? So somebody asked me earlier, because I had the title slide up there, when did photographs occur? And they start in 1929 is when they will bring a photograph in. Not all counties did that right away though. And then this is a much more, quote, in my world, modern declaration, because this is for 1940. So these materials in Wisconsin are all in an archives. So they're at one of the area research centers. An area research center is at a UW campus, or they're at the Wisconsin Historical Society. Wisconsin Historical Society has all the counties, so the rest of us just have the counties that we're responsible for. So they've all been saved. They're not floating around out there anywhere in some courthouse, dusty vault or basement or whatever it might be. And then after I filled out these forms, I have to fill out the second forms. And those are called a variety of names. This is the document that makes them a citizen. Some people call it oaths. Some people call it petitions, naturalizations, second papers. On the census, it's the one that's listed as NA. So all of these are examples of final papers that are filled out. This is the thing that makes you a citizen. If you don't have this, you're technically not a citizen. Same type of deal in that the early ones have little information. So this one is an 1879. I don't get very much information at all. The ones that are most difficult to work with are this range in here, and those tend to be the late 1890s into the early 1900s. They also ask almost no information In fact, the only thing they ask is, where did you get your declaration? And so they don't repeat that question, what country did you come from, when did you get here, etc. It's just that, where did you get your declaration filled out? This one here is a little bit later, let's see, 1924, and then in here we get into the 1940s. And this is where you see the photographs then coming in. And not every county has them, even though it was part of the law that you should have the photograph. I think for mine, I have 10 counties, and maybe I have them in half of them, the photos. So the names, the information that's requested gets more and more detailed on these, more recent one, and even these into the 20s, like right here. These are all the names of the children and their birth dates. And then you have to record, where was that child born? And then they ask, where is that child living now when you're filling out these papers? So you get a pretty good idea there of family, and you can see other children who might have come and be considered immigrants as well. The really recent ones have an exact address of where you're living, your occupation, etc. On these naturalization records, you should always be seeing a copy of the Declaration of Intention with it. So you had to bring your certificate with you, and the court would then add another set of declarations to these final papers. So usually you'd see 2 pages done. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to have all my papers that are available about my ancestors. So a lot of times people come in and really they just want to know, where in Europe should I be taking my trip, right? And so they'll just copy this page, which kind of drives me crazy because it's that back page that actually is what makes you a citizen. And we didn't give them the back page because they're kind of boring. But that's the page with the signature from the judge, the date, etc., the petition number, and so on, that would give you that information. So I said that they generated lots of paperwork, so these are the 2 main forms, but then they also generated a whole boatload of other things as they're working on becoming or documenting citizens. So after 1906, when we have that major law change, this is something new that comes into place. It's called facts for Declaration of Intention. And that's given to the immigrants, and then they would be filling this out, and there's more details than there are on some of the other ones. When I talk about that stub book or the certificate, this is what's torn off and left in the court. So this is called a stub book. So you get the other part, I'm keeping this if I'm in court. So here I have what's the name and age and residence of your wife, Rosalie, 37 years old, in Gillette, and names of the children are listed as well. Sorry, I'm fighting a cold here. The little piece of paper is one of my favorites, and that is the certificate of arrival. And the reason it's my favorite, when they exist, is it has the name of the ship nicely identified. It has this probably pretty ethnic sounding name here, and this is where we start to see when you've changed or Americanized your name. Because you'll have this certificate of arrival here with this name, and then you'll attach the certificate to these final papers here, and on final papers I'm going to give you my American name. But the certificate of arrival is the name that I came as. So that's a really good one to look for. It doesn't exist very often, and it doesn't exist early on. This one on this side is interrogations of depositions and witnesses. So if they were not sure about your moral character maybe, they would have you bring in witnesses. Well, everybody had to have a witness, but they would interrogate your witness. And as they're interrogating your witness, you are being asked more and more questions then about you as a person, and so on. Now, I did put up here one of the other kinds of documents, and that's an obvious one maybe, is the indexes. The indexes are created by the clerk of court. They are vary tremendously from county to county. I have no idea. The clerks just decided, well, let's all do it different and make it harder for them. So sometimes you'll find a card index, which is all typed up in nice alphabetical. Other times you'll find only indexes inside of each volume, which is a pain, because if you only know, like, oh, I'm looking for this time period, you could be looking in volumes and looking at 10 different volumes. A lot of people think that the indexes are arranged alphabetically. They're not. They're arranged by rough chronological order, so you have to keep that in mind. You may have to go through all the O's to find your O'Connell or whatever it might be. And the indexes, this should be no surprise, are full of mistakes. So lots and lots of them. Whether that's spelling names, whether that's one county decided to do a recopying project and they typed out an index. So when they typed the index, they couldn't understand or read the handwriting right, so they just made a big mess of everything. So really think outside that box. We had one researcher once who we were trying to help, and the name was spelled, she kept telling me, no, that's not my ancestor, no, that's not my ancestor. The name is spelled L-E-Y. And I'm like, well, can you say that name for me? Because we couldn't find anything. And she goes, well, it's Lee. And I said, oh, well, maybe we should try it L-E-E. And she's like, no, my ancestors are only L-E-Y. That's all it's ever been. I'm like, okay. So think outside that box kind of thing, right? So you might think that that's the end of all the documents, but even more were created. So this one on your far left, this denied list is kind of interesting. So there's a list that appears, these start in about the 1920s maybe, and they're called orders granting and denying citizenship. The ones that I usually find most helpful are the example that I've given here. This declaration was declared invalid because the resident, the person who applied, does not live where he filed. So he doesn't have enough residence there. The sad ones are the ones that say, citizenship not allowed, witnesses died. So his witnesses died, so they're the ones who can say, you're going to be a good citizen. So if my witnesses are dead, I can't become a citizen. I have to go find some more witnesses who will not testify again. There's a few when we were looking for this that said that the person had died, so then their certificate becomes invalid then. There's some that I would encourage you to look for too that have big red X's through the backs of them, and they're called spoiled. And they're not spoiled because some kid got a hold of it with a crayon and made a big red X behind it or on it. They're spoiled for a lot of different reasons. One, you said that you lived here this long, but we checked, and you didn't live here this long. You have to wait a while. It might be spoiled because your witness died. It might be spoiled because you didn't give up your allegiance properly. So there's all kinds of reasons. So I like to look for the spoiled ones as well and see what facts you might get on those. Here you see a different version in the center of facts for petition. Again, names of all the children, when they were born, where they live. This one has exact cities listed and so on. And then this one I put in, although it's best accessed probably through Ancestry or digital collection nowadays, and that ships passenger lists. And the reason I put it in there is I wanted to make sure to remind you that Ellis Island, despite what Hollywood and all the books have us think about, does not start until 1892. So it's sort of become this symbol about immigration, and so many people are like on ellisisland.org trying to find their ancestor. Well, if you came before 1892, you did not go through Ellis Island. You went through a place called Castle Garden if you're coming in New York. Similar kinds of things, though, where they do inspections, and if you're believed to have mental health issues or tuberculosis, like we talked about, eye disease was something that they looked at. And if you've looked at Ellis Island types of materials, there was a special hook and a tool where they would peel back your eyelid, basically, to make sure it was horrible. So think about, too, that not every immigrant came through Ellis, through New York. So there are other ports as well. Baltimore is a port. Philadelphia is a port. Texas, I think it's Houston might be a port. For us, we don't see a lot. Maybe San Francisco is a port. So think about that. And then the other thing is not every immigrant came on a ship. So we'll see some that say Grand Trunk Railway. So it's basically walking from Canada or coming on the railway from Canada to get here. Sometimes Milwaukee has been listed as a port. I think that that's really probably not accurate. I don't think that you literally got on a boat in Baden-Württemberg or Hamburg, Germany, and then you sailed all the way and you got off the boat in Milwaukee. I don't think that's quite accurate. I think that means I answered the question, that's where I came from New York, and then I got to Milwaukee, right? So hints and suggestions. I've talked about this one sprinkled throughout here. I want to repeat it, to think about all spelling possibilities. Remember, your ancestor has a thick accent. They probably don't speak English. The clerk is reporting it, who probably did not speak the language of that person. Think about how the name would have been sounded, so there's my V example, and to think about spelling ideas and spelling variations. For first names in particular, you might need to think about what's that English name. So like Wenzel has a different name. Leopold in Belgium means this in America. So sometimes in that process, you might see him on the ship's list as a Leopold, but in between everything, they might change. I think it's Paul is the right one. So they might change to their American name, right? So you have to think about that. Look at the obvious, Anderson, Anderson, Nelson, Nielsen, etc., Schmidt, 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 all the different ways you can spell that. For Scandinavian names, always keep your mind open to S-O-N and S-E-N, because again, that clerk doesn't really care that S-E-N means Danish, and maybe they just think we're all the same. S-O-N is the same as an S-E-N kind of name. Another one that people oftentimes miss is double letters. So if my name has a double S in it, sometimes when it's written during certain time periods, it'll look like an F. So you have to think about that double letter and what else might it look like. So think about the idea of Americanization so that you will fit in better. Sometimes we've all heard the stories about they couldn't spell my name when I got off the boat, so they changed it to this. That's true to an extent, but I also maybe didn't want to have that name or sound as ethnic as that name might be, so I might have Americanized it on my own self. So you want to think about those things, names and spellings. We talked about the military records. Remember, the father might have not done the process, so you might have to go looking for that son in the next generation. Don't assume things, so look for cousins and uncles and brothers and fathers to find women prior to 1922. A lot of people won't look for the brothers of the women. Well, if you look for the brother, you'll get her story about coming here as well, probably. Read every document for extra clues. There's one of them up here, but I didn't stop and point it out to you. Which one is it? This one in the middle. He is exempt from some of the things, and there's notations of what law is making him exempt. So you can read clues like that, and that might get you the extra information. Remember, the census isn't always accurate. Consider borders. We've had a lot of people who say, oh, well, my ancestor, they just came to Door County, and that's where they've always ever lived. Door County, that's where their records must be, and they're not there. Well, in the case of Door, there's a lot of crossover between other counties in northeast Wisconsin. So it depends upon where their farm might have been, where their home might have been in a town, and where they thought their economic base was. So, like, Door and Brown has a bunch of crossing, Manitowoc and Calumet has a bunch, Allegheny and Brown, so you want to check those nearby counties and consider borders as well. When you use the census, I kind of glossed over and didn't stop and specifically point this out, but it lists the names of the children and where they're born. So if you see that first child arrived in Wisconsin, or first child being born in Wisconsin isn't until 10 years after they arrived, they were somewhere else first, right? So then that 10-year span is long enough that they could have taken their citizenship papers elsewhere. So be thinking about those kinds of things. One thing that always seems to trip up my student staff is that if we're looking for final papers, so this center one here, and it has a declaration, they can't find a declaration attached to it. If you read in there, it might say declaration was filed in Sheboygan. Well, we don't have the Sheboygan records in our case, so they would have to go somewhere else. Or they were filed in such and such a county in Pennsylvania, or such and such a county in Illinois or New York. That tells you that they were somewhere else long enough beforehand to do that first steps then. So finding the citizenship papers is not onerous. There's a lot of other harder things that genealogists will do, but this one, there's a lot of challenges that might come in there, and to think about, well, how else can I find that information? So I wanted to try to give you a little bit of a sense of an idea of how to interpret and what kinds of paperwork you might be finding when you try to uncover your immigrant ancestor and their stories. So I have a general handout, brochure over there, and then a general handout that looks like this. This that's going to talk again a little bit more about citizenship records in detail. So I can take questions now if anybody has things. Yes?
Do they have any information of babies or children or people that passed away on the ship? Over?
So that's a hard one, and I think if everybody heard the question, is there information or are there records about babies who might have passed away on the ship? Is there a way to find that? And so the best way that I know to do that is by looking at ship's passenger list. Might give you some clues there. If the baby was born, obviously before the person got on the ship. You're taking the infant, it wasn't a baby born on the ship. So then the ship's passenger lists are the only way that I know to get that information. We've had some people dig around and try to get log books or those kinds of things, but they're very scarce where the captain of the ship is recording kind of what's happening, but those don't exist very much out there. Other questions? Yes?
Not really a question, but we've gone to Ireland, and on the tour they were saying people were asking about their families and where they were from and stuff. And the tour guide said that at one point there was a British law that only allowed you to have 2 children that were untaxed, and people couldn't find the rest of their families. They knew they were born there, and they suggested that you look at baptismal records.
Sure.
Because they were registered as baptized, but not as part of a family and whatever the city record count, whatever.
Interesting.
Because they were taxed, so
Right,
they just
right.
didn't claim them.
Right. Very similar here, like I didn't mention it, vital records were not required in Wisconsin until 1907. So I will register my baptism if I'm a church person, so I'll do that before I'll go to the courthouse. So it's a very similar type of thing. And then, let's say oddly, one kid was born on a bright summer day and they happened to have a quarter that you needed to register, and they were going to town with a load of corn anyway. So they might have registered that child, but the 5 who were born before, it's as if they don't exist. So that's similar if we would look at church records. That's a good one. Yes, in the back.
What would be a reason why somebody would have different countries of origin listed on the different census records? So, for example, one of my ancestors is listed as being from Russia in 1930, and then her husband got citizenship in 1939. He's from Russia, but then in 1940 census, it says she's from Poland.
That's going to be boundary changes as we're speeding into World War II, I would guess. So when you look at German, Poland, Russia, that grouping of countries, and then also Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, when you look in those 2 kinds of groups, the boundaries are changing all the time, and who is the governor or the president, the czar, whatever it might be, as those are changing, then I would say that that's how it is. And some people, there are subgroups, right? So Serbia and Croatia would be an example. So if somebody asked me that question, I might more identify with the ethnic group of Croatia. Others might say Serbia, but we're within the same geographic boundary. So it could be that too, that I consider myself Polish, but I'm living here in this Russian geographic definition. Does that make sense?
Okay. So that should probably give you a good sense of what region they came from, I would assume. If you know that particular city used to be Russia and now it's Poland,
Yep, exactly.
that would help narrow down.
Yep.
Okay.
And I should have added up here, and I didn't even think about that until you asked your question. If you have, through any of these resources, found a city and you're like, I can't find it anywhere, there are some things that are on the internet, some nice stuff that will allow you to find little sort of cities that don't exist anymore, that were wiped out by the wars. But there's also, like, we have an amazing atlas, and I think maybe 9.5 times out of 10 I can do it. The atlas is from 1922, and it was published by the London Times, and I can get almost every one of those little cities, and we can see it between the 2 wars. So to look for one of those kinds of historic atlases would be another way to help you look at boundary changes then.
Thank you.
Yes?
I have a question. According to hearsay or the family generations, that during World War I, some people were afraid that they were going to be shipped back. And I have no way of knowing as to whether my great-grandparents actually became citizens or not, even though my grandfather was born in this country.
So your grandfather was born here, but
Right.
his parents were not.
Right.
Okay. about his parents then,
Right.
how we tell that. So did you find him in any census records at all?
I don't know, I haven't gone back into census history.
Okay.
I know that they were born in Germany. I mean,
Okay.
they always talk about Mecklenburg and Schwerin,
Okay.
so Northern European.
Sure. So that might be worth trying to poke around and see if you could find him on a census. And also then in your grandfather's case, if he's of the right time period, that he would be alive in the 1930, 1940 census. Remember they asked the question, your father and mother's birthplace, and at that time period they have to specify specific parts of Germany, so that might be helpful. Those kinds of things might give you some clues, but the census would be a really good place to start. See if you can figure out that. Does that sound helpful? Or?
Well, yes, so thereabouts maybe.
Okay, well, you can come and ask me later if you want to. Other questions? Yes?
I've been looking on Ancestry.com for the census records, and sometimes they're not photographed clearly, or the index to them. Is there another source for seeing a census record or index that I could get to verify what I think is handwritten down?
So Ancestry, as you might have discovered, when they pop up with a little pop-up of the name, that has been provided by some volunteer or a genealogist who's connected to that individual. So that's somebody's interpretation of that handwriting. So you can just totally disregard that and say, well, I know that that's a P, not an R, or whatever it might be that you're thinking. So that's one thing, and partially to answer. Most of the area research centers, and if not that, the State Historical Society has it. I don't know for sure what Appleton Public Library has in terms of census records. Most of us still have them on microfilm.
Yes, we do too.
So just because Ancestry has them digitally, most of us did not get rid of our microfilm, which is the source then that we would all been going to. So you can find your local library here and sit down and look at them on microfilm. If you need something outside of Wisconsin or this geographic area, the Wisconsin Historical Society has all of them. So you can look there as well.
Yeah, I have found something about the Wisconsin Historical Society. I found some marriages pre-1907.
Sure.
But they listed all the men together and all the women together. And the only way you could match it was by date.
Oh, sure. So that pre-1907 index is one on the Wisconsin Historical Society website and in Ancestry. That pre-1907 index does not have sound decks attached to it. So the only way you can do it is that's going to be a literal spelling. It's going to be matching by date like you're talking about. You might find it more helpful sometimes to go back the old-fashioned way. We in Green Bay and all the area research centers will have it. Wisconsin Historical Society has it. Some public libraries have it. And that's the original index that would have come from. So it's stuff on sheets of microfiche, and then that's what Ancestry digitized. But on the microfiche, it's sometimes easier to see spelling variations and connections that way. So sometimes the old-fashioned way is a better way.
And I do have another suggestion on the Lutheran Church from the Northern European countries.
Sure.
They used to have different synods for each nationality. Because I know I went to confirmation on the Augustana which was
Oh, sure.
and the Emmanuel was Norwegian and the United was German.
Yep. Similar to those Catholic churches that I mentioned in Green Bay, they each have their different ethnicity. It's true. And with the religion ones, if you don't know it, you want to look for their centralized repository. So if it's Catholic, there's a diocesan archives. Wisconsin has 3 of them. Other states would have similar. The states are all carved up, so that's where the records are sent to. If it's Lutheran, they're more centralized at a couple headquarters in the Midwest. So all the churches have that kind of centralized bringing together of little church records, I guess, or little congregations.
There's also a suggestion of the union and the occupation, those that base their promotions on seniority, career road. Because I know they publish books of date of hire to keep track of their seniority.
And that's where you can start looking at waves of immigrants and ethnic groups. So like I know in Green Bay, for example, the Irish came in and they became the railroad workers. And so here's this whole neighborhood of a certain style of houses, and you start looking in a census and occupations, and it's, oh, look at that's all the Irish railroad workers kind of thing. Yep. Other questions? Yes?
Question, the Area Research Center up in Green Bay used to be open like one Saturday a month. Are they still open?
works around with the school break schedule. So it tends to be, we aim for pretty close to 4 to 5 weeks apart. We don't have them in January because we don't have enough student staff. So they will be September through December, and then February through May. So and I don't have my dates memorized for my February.
Is it posted on the?
It's posted online, yeah. Yep. Yep.
How about parking there? Deb, how's that changed?
So parking at UWGB has underwent a transformation as of 2 weeks ago. Or roughly. So parking at UWGB is still free if you come 5 times or less a year. That doesn't mean I don't want to see you like, oh, nope, number 6, Deb doesn't want to see me, I want to see you right now. No, come on in. And the only thing is that you have a different process that you have to follow. So you have to pay for your parking via an app or a phone call to an 800 number. So once you reach that 5 on time number 6, you'll do an app and you just pay from your phone, or you'll call an 800 number and pay from that way. So similar to your parking meters out here, I guess. So I spoke on everybody's behalf and said, oh, wait a minute, what does that mean for my researchers? So we're doing the best we can. So we will have information updated on our website, but just come on in. We're there to help you. And one of the things that I guess I'll do a plug, one of the things that we pride ourselves on at Green Bay is that we try our hardest to get you in the right direction. So even though we may not have that information, we will help you dig and help you try to find where do I go to get that information. And I didn't allude to it at all because it doesn't really fit with the citizenship or the immigrants process. We can borrow things for you. So the Area Research Center in Green Bay is one of 13. We're part of a network connected with the Wisconsin Historical Society. We're the only state in the nation that does this. Like if you've used interlibrary loan for books or DVDs, we use interlibrary loan for archives. And we're the only state who does it. We will literally move the archival collections around. So either that means we're crazy, progressive, I don't know, I'm thinking progressive. So if you have a Civil War ancestor and you want to look at their Civil War records, those are stored in Madison. Just talk to us and we will bring them up and you can look at them in Green Bay. If you want to look at homestead claims or that collection I mentioned, Germans in Wisconsin, shoot me an email. We will order it for you and it'll be up in Green Bay for you to look at then. You don't have to drive around the state if you don't want to. Question?
What if you know somebody came, my husband's great-grandfather came from Norway and they settled in Iowa, and I know he became a citizen, but I don't know where. How do you track that down?
Do you have a time frame?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, so we would start by looking at a time frame and then start by looking. Iowa is very similar to us in terms of that their citizenship records are centralized, so they're going to be under the governance of Iowa Historical Society or State Historical Society, whatever they're called. So we would start looking that way and see if we could find some clues, and dates will matter. And I would look for where's that first child born, the first child born in America, first child born in Iowa, and that might give you a pretty good clue. I think Iowa has some, via Ancestry, they may have some combined citizenship indexes. So where they've said, like, here's all the people who became citizens in Iowa. So that's one of the things I've noticed with Iowa records is they're going to be for mine anyway. But they do a lot of group indexing, so to speak, or put it out there on Ancestry at least. Other questions? Yes?
Is there a brick-and-mortar Wisconsin Historical Society building?
Yep, it's on 816 State Street. So if you're familiar with the UW-Madison campus or maybe UW-Madison Union, it is right across the street from the Union. Or if you're familiar with the Capitol, the Museum on the Square, or the Farmers Market, it's right down State Street. So it's in the heart of campus. But more and more they are putting things out digitally, as most of us are, for people to be able to access it that way. But a lot of things you have to go there for. And many people, put in a plug for them, many people hear the word Wisconsin Historical Society and like, oh, well, most of my stuff's in Illinois or Iowa, that's not going to help me, or I'm already in Ireland or whatever. They collect nationally, and they have been collecting nationally since 1846, prior to statehood. So they do have, and they're considered second largest history of North America library in the United States, second only behind the Library of Congress. So if you, like I have Iowa roots and Minnesota roots and South Dakota, so I can still do my genealogy because I just go down to Madison and they have and they have the regimental histories of Illinois, so we can do that kind of research there as well. So we're very lucky in Wisconsin. It's a huge treasure trove of materials. Other questions? Well, I thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and if you have other